Hi everyone, welcome to Advanced Statistics for the Social Sciences. In this lecture, I will introduce the concept of two-factor ANOVA, which is an extension of last week's material discussing one-factor ANOVA. The situation where we'd want to use two-factor ANOVA is for a research scenario where we have two categorical predictor variables, and as always in this class, we talk about a numeric or continuous outcome variable. Just one. So the difference here is that we would be adding an additional categorical predictor, or also known as a factor, to our one-way ANOVA model. So let's jump right in with an example of when we would use two-factor ANOVA. So throughout these next video lectures, I'll be using this video game study as an example for two-factor ANOVA. In this example, a researcher is studying the effects of violent video games on aggressive behavior in young boys and girls. 30 children are assigned to participate in a 30-minute session where they either read, which is the control condition, play a non-violent video game, or they play a violent video game. The dependent variable is a measure of aggression that represents the number of times a child hits, kicks, or pushes another child during a 15-minute play session. So let's talk about the data generating process here. The concept behind ANOVA is that, again, we're talking about mean differences as we were with one-factor ANOVA. But now we've got two factors to consider. So we are going to say that if either the video game conditions or gender, or both, influence aggression, then the observations no longer come from the same population. Rather, the video game condition and the gender groups will define distinct populations with unique means. So it's possible that there are no gender differences, in which case we would consider all of the children one population with regard to gender, or that the type of video game versus control doesn't matter, that condition doesn't matter, and that all of the children, again, are coming from one population. So the idea is that with regard to the aggression scores, the observations are either coming from the different populations as categorized by the factors, the levels of the factors, or they're all coming from the same population. So, as we've discussed already, ANOVA divides the variability into three sources. There's the variation that's due to each predictor variable, 3 now because we've got 2 predictor variables, and then there's the leftover error variation. So now, instead of having a sort of pie chart for variability or variation with just 2 parts, we've got 3 parts because we're separating out the part due to the predictors or the model into each predictor variable. We're still going to use a calculated sum of squares and the variances to quantify the size of these partitions of variability in the same way that we did with regression. So the two-factor ANOVA has 3 hypotheses, and each of them have distinct F statistics. So the reason that we have 3 testable hypotheses, that's alternate hypotheses, is that we've got the hypothesis for the combined effect of all predictors, and that would be the sum of all of the predictor pie slices of variability. And that would be the alternate hypothesis that all group means differ. So that would be categorizing groups by both gender and by type of video game, and creating the alternate hypothesis that all of those group means differ. Or at least 2 of those group means differ, but categorized by all of those groups. And then we can also test the influence of the individual predictors. So that would be the single predictor pie slice, and we've got 2 of them. And that would be that the group means for that particular predictor differ. So there's a hypothesis that the male and female group means differ, and there's another hypothesis that the video game condition means differ. So how we refer to these designs is we would call this a 2x3 design. So that is telling us, first of all, before we get into those numbers, what 2 and 3 mean, we have 2 factors, okay? So the first factor, we're going to call the first factor gender. And that 2 in the 2x3 design indicates that there are 2 levels of the gender factor. And the 2 levels are male and female. And then the 3 in the 2 by 3 design is referring to the second factor, which we are calling type of video game condition. And that factor has 3 levels: control, nonviolent, and violent. So the 2 by 3 design indicates that there are 2 factors, one with 2 levels and one with 3. Let's say that we had a design with 2 factors, but one of the factors had 4 levels and one had 5. In that case, we would call it a 4 by 5 design. But because we have a 2 by 3 design, when we cross those conditions, we see that we can come up with 6 combinations of conditions, and each participant serves in one of the 6 cells. So each child is receiving a different condition on video game, and each child is either male or female. The balanced part of the design, the word balanced simply indicates that for each cell, there is an equal sample size to the other cells. So you'll see that in each of the cells in this table, at the very bottom of each cell, it says n equals 5, and that's the same across all of the cells. That's what balanced design means. It means that there are equal numbers in each cell. So each cell has its own mean and its own standard deviation. But the sums of squares don't use the cell means, which is important to note. So again, as I just described, a balanced design means that each combination of groups or each cell broken out by the factors, the levels of the factors, has the same number of participants. And so a balanced design is desirable because we can assume that the predictors are uncorrelated when the design is balanced. What that means is that knowing which condition a person is in, it tells us nothing about their gender or vice versa. So essentially what this means when the design is balanced is that each predictor accounts for unique variation above and beyond the other predictor. So what we mean by that, how we can make these assumptions of the predictors being related or unrelated, is that with a balanced design where we have an equal number of participants in each cell, and we've kind of blocked it out in that way, each predictor is contributing to the outcome in a specific way, but there's no overlap between the 2 predictors because there's no overlap between these cells, if that makes sense. And then for the unbalanced design, if we have an unbalanced design, if we have kind of unequal group numbers, that can lead to a potential effect where the first predictor is related in some way to the second predictor. And that is not great because when the 2 predictors are related, we can't really tease out if you look at this Venn diagram on the right, we can't really tease out which predictor is then accounting for the variation in the outcome. So at the very center of the Venn diagram on the right, there's that little triangle where the 2 predictors and the outcome all overlap, all 3. And it's hard for us to say, it's impossible for us to say which predictor is accounting for that variation in the outcome, or if they're working together to account for that variation in the outcome. And so that creates problems for us when it comes to inference and conclusions from our statistical analyses. This concludes the first lecture for two-factor ANOVA, and in the next lecture, we will dive into talking about marginal means and also the concept of main effects, which is unique to two-factor ANOVA or factorial ANOVA.